Hello, this is Mator, the creator of the Ghost Froom, and this is part 3 of my explanation for the Ghost Froom. In this video, I will be explaining the Shroom Lift, which is the most difficult step of making the Ghost Froom. However, before doing the Shroom Lift, I'm going to explain what goes into it. I'm basically going to present to you all the pieces, and then I'm going to put them all together, sort of like a puzzle. This is very much kind of the process that I had to go through to discover the Shroom Lift, to think of it, to even get the idea. I just had to put all these pieces together and make a masterpiece. So, the first piece is barriers. Barriers were placed in considerably more volume in Halo PC. So, there's a lot of barriers in Halo PC that aren't on Halo Xbox. These barriers were created to prevent players from getting outside of the map. Players were doing that quite a bit on Xbox, so that's what the developers did. However, stunters still managed to figure out a way to get past these barriers and outside of the map. There are two methods to do this. You can launch outside of the map and then fly up from underneath. So this is something that you would do, for instance, in a cave. You set up a warthog, you stand on top of it, you throw some explosives in front of it, and it pushes you through the ceiling of the cave and launches you upward, and then you land on the cliff on top. The second method is a more direct method. It involves pushing straight through the barrier. This is the one that I'll be demonstrating. And so, I'm just going to show you right here. There's a barrier right here. You can tell because I can't drive the Banshee onto the cliff, and if I were to try to exit backwards, I wouldn't be able to walk on the cliff. This is again the barrier, which is sort of like an invisible wall, or a transparent wall. So all that I'm going to do is I'm going to drive my Banshee up towards the top of the cliff and exit it early. This way, I will fly up between the Banshee and the barrier, and the Banshee will hit me from behind and push me through the barrier. Like so. There we go. So, this is the top of the cliff. From here, you can walk around, explore a bit. You can't pass this. This is another outer barrier, which wasn't present on Xbox. On Xbox, actually, Blood Gulch extended way far away. It was pretty ridiculous. On PC, however, it just stops right here, which is outer BSP layer, like the outer boundary of the level. And you cannot jump off the cliff because the barrier is solid from both sides. This is because both sides of the barrier are inside of the map. And yeah. So there's pretty much no way down from the top of the cliff, save for dying or getting into a vehicle that's on the other side. Because I don't have anyone to take a vehicle up to me, usually a Banshee, I'm just going to have to switch teams and switch back. Okay. So, moving on, we now have vehicle lifting. Vehicle lifting is the act of lifting a vehicle up a wall using usually a Banshee. At first, only ghosts were lifted. However, just recently, I think it was 2010, a stunner named Mint figured out how to lift hogs. Pretty cool. So, first off, I'm going to demonstrate a ghost lift. So, I'm just going to start by placing the ghost on the wall, and then I'm going to get a Banshee. And what I'm going to do with the Banshee is I'm going to drive into the wall, not so much into the ghost, but into the wall below the ghost, so that I ascend slowly. I'll just demonstrate on this wall right now. You can kind of see this allows me a very controlled ascent, rather than this, which would be really fast. It also pushes the Banshee's nose against the wall, so that it's directly below the ghost. As you can see. And I'm going to be lifting primarily. I want to push directly under the ghost's center of mass so it doesn't rotate, so I usually just push right here on it, kind of between the wing and the hull. I'm just going to lift it up the wall, and then when I stop, the ghost will stay on the wall. This is due to the extremely high friction between the ghost and the base wall. This is due to certain lines which kind of, if you may, cut into the wall, especially the feet of the ghost right there, kind of cuts straight into the wall. And that's what keeps the ghost on the wall. With a warthog, of course, there are no faces which really cut into the wall, so it's a lot more difficult to get it to stay afterwards. And that's it. So, putting these things together, we have a Ghost Shroom right over here, which we can move pretty much anywhere on the map, pretty freely. We have vehicle lifting, which involves lifting vehicles up walls, and we have barriers. Now we have one more thing, Banshee barriers, which is kind of like the ceiling of the Banshee. It's like about as high as you can fly, as high as the game lets you. This is due to the Banshee barrier, which is a slightly elastic barrier. And so, putting all these things together, we get a Shroom Lift, which is where you take a Ghost Shroom and lift it up a cliff wall and into a barrier, because it can't really stay in the wall. There's no high friction which can make it stop. However, before we can just go about and do a Shroom Lift on any cliff wall, there's one final ingredient, and that's the gradual transition. Essentially, to start the lift in a cliff wall, you have to have a gradual transition from the ground to the cliff wall. You can't go straight from horizontal ground to vertical cliff wall just because it doesn't make any sense. I mean, the way that you push the Ghost, you're exerting a horizontal force on it, and you have to kind of push almost from underneath, like you have to push in a way that's parallel. A certain component of your force that exceeds the gravitational force has to be parallel to the face of the cliff that you want to push up, and that component is 0 if you're going from horizontal ground to vertical cliff. So, yeah. So this is an example of a gradual transition which we can push the Ghost Froom into. There are very few gradual transitions which work. This one is close, but doesn't work, and just about every other cliff, either the Banshee barrier is too low, or the transition is too much. Anywho. So yeah, that really limits the number of feasible lifts on any given map. That and the Banshee barrier. So, I'm now going to do the Shroom Lift at the Red Base Cliff. But first, I have to push the Ghost Shroom to the cliff. And this is pretty simple. You just kind of drive into the ground such that some of your velocity is going forward to push the Ghost, but not all of it, because, well, you can only push the Ghost Shroom so fast in the ground, because again, the bottom of it is non-solid, so if you push it too fast, it could get critical oscillations, which would lead it to just entirely flip out of the ground, which you don't want. Now, I'm at an especially interesting section of the map. There are a few of these on some maps. Essentially, if you push a vehicle in the ground through this section, for some reason the game thinks the entire vehicle, at least with certain vehicle insides, is entirely outside of the map, and will thus de-render the entire vehicle. Not just the visual model either, sometimes the visual model and the collision model. And when this happens, well, if the entire collision model is de-rendered and there's no way that you can touch it again, well, that Ghost is stuck there. It's essentially a permanent phantom, a permanent ghost, you could say. It's untouchable, it's unmovable, it's just there, and that's the end of it. So usually to avoid this, I kind of stick to a small path so as to avoid the de-rendering, which is what I'll do right now. Sometimes when the de-rendering occurs, I use a tank and I'm able to touch the Ghost and re-render it, make it solid again. Anywho, I just push the Ghost up this hill. You have to be especially careful in the hill. You can't really stop pushing it, otherwise it'll slide forward and out of the hill and come out of the ground, which is no good. And that's that. I should also mention that you should not use any explosives near the Ghost Shroom or flip it, because again, it'll come right out of the ground. It's very delicate. So, I am now ready to start the Shroom Lift. I'm now at the cliff, and I'm ready for the lift. Now I should say, the lift is extremely difficult, and this is for a couple of reasons. First off, both the Ghost, the face which we're going to be pushing on, and the nose of the Banshee, which we're going to be lifting with, are round. This makes lifting very difficult, because it's almost like bouncing a basketball on your head. The Ghost is essentially always slipping to the left or the right. And if the Ghost slips off of your Banshee, it'll flip out of the wall because of gravity. It'll sort of oscillate, kind of just come outward. It does so really quickly too, so you always have to keep the Ghost on top of the Banshee. You can't stop the lift. Once you start, it's to the end or failure, pretty much. And again, if it flips out of the wall, you have to start all the way over again with a new Ghost Shroom. So you can imagine this is a really long process. Messing up is, it's not very forgiving, for certain. And because of how the ghost is always slipping off the Banshee, you really have to understand how it moves. You have to kind of know which way it's going to move before it moves that way, so you can adjust to cancel that movement before it occurs. So this makes it really hard. It's definitely a skill you have to learn. It's not something that you can just come out of nowhere and just do. You have to fail hundreds of times before you can Shroom Lift. For this reason, to this day, I'm the only person to be able to complete a Shroom Lift that I know of. So, yeah. There's a few more factors which go in that make this difficult. First off, it's really slow going. You can't Shroom Lift very quickly because then you'd lose control. So you have to go very slowly, and slow means the Shroom Lift takes a very long time, which gives you a lot of chances to mess up. It also makes it pretty tiring. And as if that wasn't enough, there's one more thing. Transitions. This is where the cliff changes its slope. So say for instance from this area to this area. What essentially happens there is, again, you have to apply more force to get the ghost from this part of cliff to this part of cliff. So you have to aim up more. However, aiming up more gives you less control of the shroom, because as you aim up more, the front of the Banshee gets more rounded, so it's able to oscillate easier. So that makes it pretty insane. So I'm going to do the Shroom Lift now. I'm just going to push the Ghost Froom into the first section and then continue on the way up. Now it's interesting, this first section is actually the place where I messed up the most. I probably messed up in this first section 100 times because I didn't know how to control the Shroom. I mean, you can see here I have a whole way that I'm pushing it with the Banshee. I'm always adjusting, at least by little bits, and doing this is what allows me to control the Shroom. I've gotten really good at it now after doing this hundreds of times. Anywho, I'm now going to do the first transition, which is right here. This is what makes this section pretty difficult. You have to do a transition pretty quickly. So I'm going to aim up more vertically, and there we go, getting past the section. I'm now in the next section of cliff. However, this section of cliff ends in a point, so I can't Shroom Lift all the way into the barrier in this section of cliff. I have to switch to another section. So I'm just going to lift about 3/4 the way up this section, and then I have to do a transfer, a horizontal transfer even, through a solid line into another section of cliff. And this transfer is ridiculous. I mean, essentially, again, because it's a transfer and slope, you have to apply more force on the ghost. In this case, though, because it's a horizontal transfer, I have to apply more horizontal force. And doing that means that I'm no longer as much underneath the ghost. And that means that when it does do the transition, I'm not underneath it to catch it. So I have to do this crazy kind of like loop around to catch it after it does the transition. Sort of like this. Yeah, I've gotten better at that over the years, but it's still very difficult. Now I just lift up the last section very carefully. At that edge of the cliff, the edge of the two sections, it's very easy to get your Banshee caught on that edge, and that can mess you up very easily. Anywho, I'm now at the barrier, and I'm going to do the final transition into the barrier. This is a large transition, so I have to aim up considerably, which in turn sacrifices a lot of control of the ghost, which can make me mess up. I mess up here a lot. So I'm just going to aim up. Oh, no. Okay, here we go. And there we go. Cool. I now have a Ghost Shroom in barrier. When first I got this, I was screaming. I invited everyone to the server. It was just like, look at this! I did it! It was really cool. Nowadays, it's much less climatic though, because I've done it so many times now. Anywho, this is the Shroom Lift, and this is a Ghost in Barrier. And this is the end of this section. I will see you in the next one.